The night Archie Harrison was born should have been one of the most celebrated moments in recent royal history. A new baby, a fresh chapter, and a symbol of hope for a monarchy that had been struggling to adapt to modern times. Yet, instead of clarity and joy, what the world got was confusion, secrecy, and a series of strange inconsistencies that only deepened as the years went by. People were left asking questions that never seemed to find honest answers. Where exactly was Meghan when she went into labor? Why was the press not alerted in the same way as with previous royal births? Why did even members of staff, who lived and worked close to Meghan and Harry, admit later that they were unsure of what really happened on the day Archie came into the world? It is within this fog of secrecy that a startling confession from Archie's nanny, Lauren, has recently resurfaced, one that has reignited the debate over whether Meghan Markle ever gave birth to Archie at all. Imagine being tasked with caring for the child of two of the most famous people in the world, yet never being allowed to ask simple, natural questions about the circumstances of his birth. That was the strange environment Lauren described when she finally spoke about her experience. She admitted that the protocols in place around Archie's arrival were unlike anything she had ever seen in her long career caring for children of high-profile families. Staff were ordered not to inquire about details. Even those closest to Meghan were discouraged from small talk about the baby's delivery. Medical professionals who should have been front and center were strangely absent or hidden in the shadows. The result was a surreal silence that left people like Lauren wondering what truth was being so fiercely guarded. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The middle of this mystery lies in Meghan's portrayal of herself during her pregnancy. To the outside world, she appeared radiant and glowing, stepping out in carefully staged photo opportunities, her hand often placed conspicuously on her growing belly. Tabloids ran endless stories about her maternity outfits, while fans praised her as the image of modern motherhood. Yet behind the scenes, staff were noticing peculiarities. Some swore the bump appeared to change shape or size depending on the day. Others whispered that Meghan's behavior didn't match that of an expectant mother in her final trimester. And now, Lauren's confession only seems to confirm that what the staff were witnessing may not have been a natural pregnancy at all, but rather a carefully managed performance meant to hide the use of surrogacy. But why hide it? That is the question that continues to haunt this story. Surrogacy itself is no longer taboo in most modern societies. Many celebrities and high-profile figures openly share their journeys, and the public often embraces their honesty. Yet within the walls of Buckingham Palace, things are different. Image and tradition carry extraordinary weight. The monarchy depends on stability, continuity, and a sense of natural legitimacy passed down through bloodlines. For Meghan, who was already facing scrutiny as an outsider, admitting that Archie was born via surrogate may have been perceived as another strike against her credibility. The palace might have worried that such an announcement would fuel criticism, diminish the image of a modern fairy tale, and cause rifts within the institution. So, instead of openness, a veil of silence was thrown over the truth, and staff like Lauren were forced into complicity. Consider the irony of it all. A family whose very existence is broadcast to the world, whose lives are dissected in minute detail, yet one of the most intimate and important events, the birth of a child, remains clouded in secrecy. The palace has always walked a delicate line between privacy and duty, but this time, the balance tilted heavily toward concealment. Lauren's role in this story adds a deeply human element. She was not a journalist chasing a headline, nor a critic with an agenda. She was a caretaker, someone whose job it was to nurture and protect a child. For her to admit discomfort and suspicion speaks volumes about the atmosphere of unease surrounding Archie's arrival. In her quiet confession, Lauren described feeling as though she was part of a play in which the script had already been written. Everyone had their role, but no one was allowed to deviate or ask why certain things didn't make sense. The staff were instructed to follow protocols that seemed excessive, even absurd. Access to Archie was tightly controlled. There were moments when the baby would appear in unexpected ways, with little explanation of how he had been moved or who had been caring for him before. Nurses and aides whispered among themselves, but even in those private exchanges, there was a sense of fear. Fear of saying too much, fear of being overheard, fear of losing their jobs. Lauren herself admitted that she struggled with guilt, torn between her professional loyalty and her personal instinct that something was not being told. The story of Archie's birth also exposes the tension between the Sussexes and the wider royal family. Unlike William and Catherine, whose children were born in hospitals with media gathered outside, Meghan and Harry pursued a path of secrecy. They issued statements that contradicted themselves. They delayed public appearances. They released heavily edited photographs rather than straightforward press calls. Every move seemed designed not to share joy, but to control information. To the public, this came across as bizarre. To insiders like Lauren, it was suffocating. And now, years later, her words give weight to what many suspected all along. That there was something to hide, something bigger than mere privacy. The ending of this introduction must bring us back to the heart of the matter. This is not just about whether Meghan carried Archie. It is about trust. It is about the relationship between the public and those who live in palaces funded by taxpayers. It is about the credibility of a couple who have built careers on their truth, while silencing those who witnessed a different reality. Lauren's confession is powerful not because it offers every answer, but because it cracks open the wall of silence and reveals how deeply unusual Archie's arrival truly was. It reminds us that sometimes the most shocking revelations come not from official statements, but from the quiet words of those who were closest to the truth. And so, as we move into the chapters ahead, we will journey deeper into this story. The day Archie was born, the strange protocols imposed on staff, the contradictions in Meghan's public image, the silence of Harry, and the long shadow this has cast on the royal family. Every layer peels back another piece of a puzzle that has captivated the world for years. Because in the end, the truth has a way of surfacing, and when it does, it changes everything. The day Archie Harrison arrived was supposed to be one of the happiest days in modern royal history. The nation, and indeed the world, had been waiting for this moment with eager anticipation. Months of speculation about Meghan Markle's pregnancy had created a frenzy of headlines, photo analyses, and public debates. People compared her to Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, who had delivered her children in full view of tradition, stepping outside the hospital doors with her newborns just hours after giving birth. But when Archie's birth was announced, things didn't unfold in the way anyone expected. Instead of clarity and celebration, the day was marked by confusion, secrecy, and a series of events that left even seasoned royal correspondents baffled. The announcement itself was odd. Traditionally, when a royal baby is born, Buckingham Palace issues a straightforward statement and a ceremonial easel is placed outside to inform the public. Media outlets are usually briefed ahead of time, allowing them to prepare coverage that highlights the joyous moment. With Archie, however, information seemed to drip out in fragments. At one point, the palace issued a notice that Meghan had gone into labor, only to later state that she had already given birth hours earlier. The timing didn't add up. Reporters wondered aloud whether they were being intentionally misled. Even fans of the couple were confused. How could the palace, with its centuries of carefully honed protocols, suddenly make such a blunder? Was it really a mistake, or was it deliberate? For staff within the Sussex household, the day was even more peculiar. According to Lauren and others who were close to the family, there was no sense of normalcy about Archie's arrival. Unlike the usual flurry of activity that accompanies a royal birth, where doctors, aides, and midwives move in and out with purpose, the atmosphere was strangely subdued. Very few people were allowed into Meghan's quarters. The staff who had expected to be on hand to support were instead given vague instructions or told to wait elsewhere. It was as if the entire operation had been stripped down to the bare minimum, with no one really knowing who was in charge or why things were being handled in such an unusual way. The secrecy was not just inconvenient, it was unsettling. Lauren later admitted that she felt as though she was walking on eggshells. She had worked with other high-profile families and knew the intensity that surrounded big events, but this was different. It wasn't just about keeping the press at bay, it was about keeping even the staff in the dark. She recalled being told not to ask questions, not to engage in casual conversation about Meghan's condition, and certainly not to speculate about the baby's arrival. For someone whose job revolved around caring for children, the lack of transparency was deeply disorienting. She felt, in her own words, as though she had been asked to perform her duties while blindfolded. Meanwhile, outside the walls of Frogmore Cottage, the world was left to piece together fragments of information. The media camped out near Windsor, desperate for a glimpse of Meghan and Harry leaving for a hospital or returning with their newborn. But no such sighting ever came. Instead, there were whispers that Meghan had given birth at home, followed by conflicting reports suggesting she had been rushed to a private hospital in London. The confusion was compounded when Harry appeared in front of the cameras to announce Archie's arrival. His words were joyous, but his demeanor struck some as oddly nervous. He thanked the staff and spoke of how incredible the experience had been, yet he offered no concrete details about where or how the birth had taken place. The lack of clarity was glaring, especially in comparison to the openness that had characterized other royal births. Lauren's experience that day offers a crucial perspective. She recalled how staff were gathered and given instructions that made little sense. They were told to avoid certain areas of the residence, to refrain from casual chatter, and to be ready at a moment's notice without being told what they were waiting for. At one point, she heard that Meghan had already delivered, only to be told moments later that preparations were still underway. The contradictions piled up, leaving her and others wondering whether they were being manipulated or simply misinformed. In her heart, she began to suspect that what was being presented as a natural birth was, in fact, something else entirely. The strangeness of that day did not go unnoticed by the wider royal family either. While official statements offered congratulations, there was a palpable absence of the kind of fanfare that typically surrounds such occasions. There were no hospital steps photographs, no clear timeline of events, and no smiling relatives arriving to visit mother and child. Instead, everything seemed cloaked in a layer of secrecy that raised more questions than it answered. For the public, it may have been puzzling. For staff like Lauren, who lived and worked in the midst of it, it was almost surreal. One of the most striking details Lauren later shared was how the protocols around Archie's care immediately after his supposed birth were unlike anything she had ever seen. Normally, there is a period of transition where nurses and caretakers are gradually introduced to the newborn, learning routines, and ensuring the baby's comfort. In Archie's case, access was restricted in ways that bordered on paranoia. Only a select few were permitted near him, and even then, there was little explanation of who had cared for him in those critical early hours. Lauren was deeply unsettled by the lack of transparency, feeling as though she was being asked to step into a role without being given the most basic context about the child she was meant to nurture. Adding to the confusion was the fact that the official record of Archie's birth raised eyebrows. When the birth certificate was eventually released, it contained information that seemed deliberately vague. Meghan's place of birth was listed in a way that contradicted some of the rumors, yet it failed to settle the debate. For those who had been following closely, the document only added another layer of doubt. Was it possible that the certificate had been crafted more to quell speculation than to provide the truth? Lauren, who had by then begun to trust her instincts, could not shake the feeling that she and others were being used as props in a narrative designed to hide a larger reality. The day Archie arrived, then, was not a day of pure joy and celebration, but a day of unanswered questions and growing unease. For Lauren, it marked the beginning of a chapter in her career that would haunt her long after she left the Sussex household. She had been present, she had been involved, but she had never been allowed to truly understand what had taken place. That feeling of being kept deliberately in the dark is what ultimately drove her to break her silence years later. And her words now force us to re-examine the events of that day with fresh eyes. Because when you strip away the official statements, the carefully crafted photographs, and the staged appearances, what remains are the voices of those who were closest to the truth. Voices like Lauren's, who lived through the confusion and secrecy, and who now offer a glimpse into what really happened on the day Archie was said to be born. And as we look more closely at her account, we begin to see that this was not simply a matter of privacy, but something far more calculated. Something that suggests Archie's arrival was not the straightforward birth the world was told to believe. Lauren's confession did not come all at once, nor did it explode onto the front pages in the way one might expect of a royal scandal. It emerged gradually, like a slow leak that eventually floods the room. For years, she had remained silent, bound not only by professional duty but by an unspoken fear that saying too much could ruin her reputation and her career. Yet silence carries its own weight, and for Lauren, the burden became too heavy. When she finally admitted that Archie's arrival was unlike anything she had ever witnessed in her long career, the words struck a nerve. They validated suspicions that had lingered since 2019 and cast a new light on the secrecy that surrounded Meghan Markle's supposed pregnancy. Lauren was no ordinary nanny plucked from obscurity. She had experience, training, and the trust of families who valued discretion. She knew the rhythms of newborn care and the protocols of working with high-profile clients. In other words, she was not easily rattled. And yet, when asked about her time with the Sussexes, her language was careful, cautious, and tinged with discomfort. She did not make wild accusations. She did not claim to have seen definitive proof of surrogacy. Instead, she described what she did see: protocols that were inconsistent, explanations that did not add up, and an atmosphere that felt orchestrated rather than organic. Her tone suggested a woman who had wrestled with her conscience and finally decided that the truth, even if incomplete, was better than silence. One of the most telling aspects of Lauren's confession was how she described the restrictions placed upon her from the very beginning. Normally, a nanny entering a household with a newborn is quickly integrated into the child's daily care. There is a natural handover between parents and staff, moments of bonding, and a sense of shared responsibility. With Archie, however, the process was rigid and shrouded in secrecy. Lauren admitted that she was given unusually strict instructions, with little room for questions or clarification. Access to the baby was carefully controlled. Even simple interactions were monitored. She recalled feeling as though she was stepping into a performance where her role had been scripted in advance, leaving her little freedom to act on her professional instincts. Her unease deepened when she noticed inconsistencies in how Archie was presented. Sometimes, she said, the baby would appear without explanation, as if he had been in the care of someone outside the immediate household. At other times, she was told not to disturb Meghan, even though, by her own observation, there was no sign that Meghan had been recovering from childbirth. Lauren was not a medical professional, but she had worked with enough mothers to know the physical toll childbirth takes. Meghan's energy levels, her movements, and her demeanor did not match those of a woman who had recently delivered a child. To Lauren, it seemed as if Meghan had skipped over the expected physical aftermath of labor, stepping seamlessly into the role of new mother without showing any of the vulnerabilities that accompany it. The protocols extended beyond the household staff. Lauren remembered how even visiting relatives and friends seemed to be managed with unusual caution. Instead of warm introductions and open sharing, there was a sense of performance. Guests were allowed only carefully timed glimpses of the baby, often in settings that felt rehearsed. The atmosphere was not one of a family joyfully welcoming loved ones, but of a couple determined to control every aspect of the narrative. For Lauren, this reinforced the feeling that the story being told to the world, and even to those inside the Sussex circle, was not entirely authentic. Her confession carried weight because it echoed what many had already observed from the outside. Journalists had noted the inconsistencies in Meghan's public appearances during her pregnancy, where the shape and size of her bump seemed to change dramatically from one day to the next. Photographs circulated online showing the bump appearing high and round in one image, then low and flattened in another, fueling speculation that it was not natural. At the time, defenders dismissed these observations as cruel gossip. But when Lauren spoke of the unusual protocols and the absence of normal recovery signs, it added credibility to the theory that Meghan may have used a surrogate. Lauren also admitted that her unease was compounded by the lack of medical professionals visibly involved in Archie's early care. Typically, even in high-profile households, doctors and nurses play a prominent role in those first critical days. Their presence offers reassurance, both to parents and to staff. In Archie's case, however, medical personnel were largely absent. Lauren could not recall the kind of hands-on involvement she had seen in other families. Instead, she was left with vague assurances and an unspoken directive not to probe further. It was as though the medical aspect of Archie's arrival had been deliberately erased from the narrative. What makes Lauren's confession particularly striking is the emotional weight behind it. She did not speak as someone seeking attention or revenge. She spoke as someone burdened by the knowledge that she had been part of something that felt deeply unnatural. She admitted that she had tried to push aside her doubts, focusing instead on her role as a caretaker. But over time, the dissonance became impossible to ignore. She could not reconcile her professional experience with what she had witnessed in the Sussex household. And so, when the opportunity arose to speak, she did so with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Her words also shed light on the emotional toll secrecy can take on staff members. Working in a royal household is demanding enough under normal circumstances. The constant scrutiny, the need for discretion, and the pressure to maintain professionalism can wear down even the most resilient individuals. For Lauren, those pressures were magnified by the sense that she was being asked to participate in a deception. She described feeling isolated, unable to confide in colleagues for fear of breaking the unspoken code of silence. That isolation left her vulnerable, amplifying her sense of unease and fueling the doubts that eventually compelled her to speak out. The confession did not provide definitive proof of surrogacy, nor did it answer every question. But it offered something arguably more powerful: the testimony of an insider who had nothing to gain by speaking and everything to lose. In doing so, Lauren validated the suspicions that had persisted for years. Her words suggested that the secrecy surrounding Archie's birth was not merely a matter of protecting privacy, but a deliberate effort to obscure the truth. And in a world where the royals depend on public trust, that revelation is devastating. For many observers, Lauren's account crystallized what they had long suspected: that Meghan Markle had not carried Archie herself, and that even those closest to her were kept in the dark. It was not simply a case of a family choosing privacy. It was a calculated decision to hide, to control, and to mislead. And once Lauren broke her silence, the questions that had haunted the day of Archie's arrival took on a new urgency. What else had been hidden? Who else had been silenced? And most importantly, why was the truth deemed too dangerous to tell? In the end, Lauren's confession stands as a turning point in the narrative. It transforms the speculation into something more tangible, something rooted in lived experience. Her words force us to revisit the story of Archie's birth with fresh eyes, stripping away the glossy veneer of staged photographs and official statements. They remind us that sometimes, the most revealing truths come not from grand declarations, but from the quiet honesty of those who were there, watching, waiting, and finally speaking when the weight of silence became too much to bear. The protocols that surrounded Archie Harrison's arrival were unlike anything most staff had ever encountered in royal service. To those familiar with palace life, tradition is everything. There are established ways of handling royal births, long-standing systems that bring order and reassurance in the midst of personal events. But when it came to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, those traditions seemed to vanish overnight. In their place came a set of rules and restrictions so unusual, so rigid, that they raised eyebrows even among the most loyal aides. This was not just a matter of privacy. According to those who were there, including Lauren, this was a carefully engineered system designed to prevent questions, suppress curiosity, and keep even those closest to the family in the dark. From the very beginning, staff were told what they could and could not say. Lauren later explained that conversations about Meghan's condition, Archie's care, or anything related to the delivery were off-limits. It wasn't simply professional discretion, it was an explicit instruction. Small talk was discouraged. Staff members who had spent years working in households where warmth and openness were part of daily life suddenly found themselves silenced. Even within the walls of Frogmore Cottage, a place meant to be home, the atmosphere was heavy with caution. Every word, every glance, seemed to carry the weight of surveillance. One of the most bizarre protocols was the restriction on physical access to Archie. In most royal households, nannies, aides, and nurses move freely in and out of nurseries, attending to the needs of the child without fuss. With Archie, however, entry was limited to a select few. Even those granted access were expected to follow odd guidelines. Lauren described how she was asked not to ask questions about Archie's routines or background information that would normally be critical to her role. She was to perform her duties efficiently and without probing. This went against everything she had learned in her career. A nanny's job is built on understanding a child's habits, health, and developmental milestones. To strip away that context made her role feel not only strange but incomplete. The secrecy extended to the handling of visitors. Relatives and close friends who came to see Archie were given limited access, often under watchful eyes. Some visits were staged in such a way that Meghan and Harry could control the narrative. It wasn't the usual joyous introduction of a new baby to family. Instead, it felt choreographed, as if appearances were being managed for optics rather than genuine connection. Lauren noted that she had never before seen such calculated oversight in something as simple as relatives meeting a newborn. In her experience, those first meetings were tender, spontaneous, and deeply human. With Archie, spontaneity was absent. Every detail seemed pre-planned. The unusual protocols also covered medical matters. Under normal circumstances, nannies and household staff would have some contact with doctors and nurses responsible for the baby's early care. This ensured continuity and built trust. But in Archie's case, medical professionals were conspicuously absent from daily routines. There were no introductions, no shared instructions, no sense of collaboration. Lauren and others were left with vague directives, often delivered by intermediaries rather than doctors themselves. This lack of transparency alarmed her. She wondered why medical personnel were kept so distant and whether their absence was meant to conceal more than it revealed. Adding to the strangeness were rules about photography and record-keeping. Royal households traditionally document significant milestones for private archives, often capturing behind-the-scenes moments for family history. Yet with Archie, photographs were tightly controlled. Staff were not permitted to take informal pictures. Every image had to pass through layers of approval, even those meant solely for personal keepsakes. Lauren felt as though Archie was being presented more as a symbol than as a child, his early life shielded behind carefully curated images that served a narrative rather than capturing reality. Another peculiar element was the way Meghan and Harry communicated with their staff during this period. Lauren recounted that instructions often came not directly from the couple, but through intermediaries or in writing, leaving little room for discussion. When questions arose, answers were vague or evasive. This created an environment of distance, even distrust. Staff members who had dedicated their careers to loyalty and discretion found themselves treated with suspicion, as though they might expose secrets they did not even understand. For Lauren, this was not only frustrating but deeply disheartening. She had entered the role with enthusiasm and a desire to support a new family, but instead, she found herself navigating a maze of restrictions that seemed designed to keep her ignorant. What stood out most to her was the sense that these protocols were not about protecting Archie, but about protecting a secret. Babies are vulnerable and privacy is important, yes, but there was something disproportionate about the lengths taken here. Everything felt excessive, unnecessary, and ultimately suspicious. The staff whispered among themselves, careful not to be overheard, but it was clear that many shared the same doubts. Why were they being told not to ask basic questions? Why were medical professionals absent? Why did Meghan not show the signs of a new mother's recovery? Each restriction seemed to point not toward caution, but toward concealment. Over time, the protocols began to wear on those who lived under them. Morale within the household declined. Staff who had once felt proud to serve the royals now felt unsettled, as if they were participants in a charade. Lauren admitted that she often went to bed feeling uneasy, haunted by the sense that she was complicit in something dishonest. She wanted to do her job with integrity, but integrity required truth, and truth was being withheld. The protocols that governed her every move became a daily reminder that something about Archie's arrival did not align with reality. Perhaps the most telling aspect of these restrictions was how they continued long after the initial weeks. Normally, as time passes, households settle into a rhythm. Rules relax, staff become trusted, and the sense of secrecy fades. But with Archie, the atmosphere of control lingered. Even as months went by, the protocols remained in place. Lauren realized that this was not a temporary measure to protect privacy during a vulnerable time. It was a permanent system built to guard a hidden truth. And the longer it went on, the more convinced she became that Meghan and Harry were hiding something fundamental about their son's birth. In reflecting on her time there, Lauren described the protocols as suffocating. They stripped away the natural warmth and spontaneity of caring for a child and replaced it with a sterile, scripted routine. For a nanny whose career had been built on trust, connection, and authenticity, it was a painful experience. She could not shake the feeling that she had been used as part of a larger performance, one designed to maintain an image at the expense of honesty. And when she finally broke her silence, it was these unusual protocols she cited as the clearest sign that Archie's arrival had not been what the world was told to believe. These rules and restrictions, so unusual and so rigid, now stand as evidence that the story of Archie's birth was never as simple as it was presented. They speak of a couple determined to control the narrative at all costs, even if it meant alienating the very people who were closest to them. They reveal a household built not on trust and openness, but on fear and concealment. And most of all, they raise the question that continues to haunt this story. What truth was so dangerous that it required protocols designed to silence, isolate, and deceive? Meghan Markle's public image during her pregnancy with Archie was one of the most carefully managed displays in modern royal history. Every appearance, every outfit, and every gesture was scrutinized and photographed, creating an image of a radiant mother-to-be basking in the glow of anticipation. The media endlessly reported on her fashion choices, her protective cradling of her stomach, and her statements about impending motherhood. To the public eye, Meghan appeared to embody the role of a glowing, expectant mother. But behind closed doors, according to those who were closest to her, including staff like Lauren, the private reality did not align with the public performance. And it was this sharp contrast between image and reality that added fuel to the growing suspicion that Meghan was not carrying Archie herself. One of the defining features of Meghan's pregnancy was her frequent, almost theatrical, cradling of her bump. At nearly every public appearance, whether she was walking, sitting, or even standing still, her hand rested prominently on her belly. To her supporters, this was a sweet and maternal gesture, a way of bonding with her child. To critics, however, it appeared forced, exaggerated, and sometimes even contrived for the cameras. They noted how Meghan seemed more intent on drawing attention to her stomach than simply allowing her pregnancy to speak for itself. The more she posed this way, the more it looked like a performance. And when those images were compared with accounts from staff who noticed the absence of typical signs of pregnancy behind the scenes, the cracks in the story began to widen. Photographs of Meghan during her pregnancy added to the confusion. Observers pointed out inconsistencies in the size and shape of her bump. On some days, it appeared large and round, projecting prominently from her frame. On others, it seemed smaller, flatter, or oddly positioned. Critics compiled side-by-side comparisons that went viral online, raising the question of whether Meghan was wearing a prosthetic bump. Supporters dismissed this as cruel speculation, but the images themselves were hard to ignore. Even seasoned photographers admitted privately that they had never seen such dramatic changes in such short spans of time. For Lauren and other staff members, the inconsistencies were not just visual, but practical. They noticed how Meghan moved with surprising ease late in her pregnancy, walking briskly, bending comfortably, and appearing without the physical strain common for expectant mothers nearing their due dates. It was as if she was playing the role of pregnancy rather than living it. Another striking contrast between Meghan's public image and private reality was her energy level. During public appearances, she seemed radiant, smiling for the cameras, speaking passionately about causes, and presenting herself as strong and capable. But in private, according to Lauren, Meghan did not show the exhaustion, discomfort, or physical challenges typically associated with pregnancy. There were no moments of fatigue that required her to retreat to rest for long stretches. There was no evidence of the physical toll childbirth preparations usually take on a woman's body. For Lauren, who had worked with countless new mothers, the absence of these signs was glaring. It wasn't that Meghan appeared strong. It was that she appeared untouched by the experience altogether. Adding to the dissonance was Meghan's insistence on framing her pregnancy as a deeply personal, almost spiritual journey. In interviews, she spoke about motherhood as though it were transformative, positioning herself as a symbol of modern maternal strength. Yet behind closed doors, her behavior towards staff did not reflect the warmth and vulnerability of a woman preparing to welcome a child. Instead, It was marked by control and detachment. Lauren described Meghan as guarded, rarely engaging in the kind of casual conversations about the baby that most mothers-to-be naturally fall into with those around them. Instead of speaking about cravings, sleep struggles, or the baby's kicks, Meghan remained vague, avoiding any detail that might invite closer scrutiny. To Lauren, it felt as though Meghan was constructing a story rather than living an experience. The carefully managed public image extended to Meghan's fashion choices. Every outfit she wore seemed designed to accentuate her bump. Flowing gowns, tailored coats, and form-fitting dresses all highlighted her stomach in a way that drew the eye. The media coverage reinforced this image, praising her as a style icon who was redefining maternity fashion. But again, the contrast with reality was sharp. Lauren noticed how the bump sometimes shifted unnaturally beneath Meghan's clothing, as though it was not part of her body but an accessory being adjusted. There were moments when the bump seemed to fold slightly as Meghan sat down, an occurrence that medical professionals later remarked would not happen with a natural pregnancy. These oddities fueled speculation online and raised further questions among those in the household. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of Meghan's public versus private image was the way she used her pregnancy to shape her narrative in the media. At a time when she was facing criticism from tabloids and tension with the royal family, her pregnancy became a shield. To criticize Meghan during this period was to risk being accused of cruelty toward an expectant mother. She spoke openly about the struggles of being in the public eye while pregnant, evoking sympathy and painting herself as a victim of relentless scrutiny. Yet for staff like Lauren, the reality behind palace walls was very different. Meghan was not fragile, vulnerable, or overwhelmed. She was in control, orchestrating appearances, and ensuring that her pregnancy remained a central part of her brand. It was less about the journey of motherhood and more about the power of perception. The media, knowingly or unknowingly, played into this narrative. Headlines celebrated Meghan's modern approach to pregnancy, contrasting her with Catherine, who embodied traditional royal motherhood. Meghan was praised for breaking boundaries, for holding her bump proudly, and for taking control of her image. But while the press amplified this glowing portrayal, those within the household were seeing something entirely different. They were watching a woman who, rather than preparing for the challenges of childbirth, seemed focused on the optics of pregnancy itself. And as Lauren later admitted, it was this gap between what the world was shown and what the staff experienced that convinced her something was deeply amiss. The divide between Meghan's public image and private reality raises questions not just about Archie's birth, but about the larger issue of authenticity. In the royal family, perception has always mattered, but it is usually tethered to reality. With Meghan, the perception seemed untethered, crafted with precision but lacking the grounding of lived experience. For Lauren, this became impossible to ignore. Every time Meghan stepped out in front of cameras cradling her bump, she was reminded of the odd protocols, the absence of medical professionals, and the lack of genuine maternal signs she had witnessed firsthand. The disconnect was stark, and it left her feeling as though she was watching two separate stories unfold, one for public consumption and one that remained hidden in the shadows. As time went on, the strain of maintaining this dual image became evident. Meghan and Harry's relationship with the media grew increasingly contentious, with lawsuits and public statements designed to control the narrative. Yet even as they fought for privacy, Meghan continued to make her pregnancy a central element of her story. To the outside world, this seemed contradictory. To Lauren and others, it was entirely consistent with the idea that the pregnancy was more performance than reality. After all, if the truth was hidden, then the image became everything. And protecting that image required not only secrecy, but constant reinforcement through public. The chapter of Meghan's public image versus her private reality is crucial because it shows how carefully orchestrated narratives can mask deeper truths. It demonstrates how a woman celebrated as a glowing, expectant mother may, behind the curtain, have been playing a role designed to conceal an arrangement that the royal family and Meghan herself deemed too controversial to reveal. Lauren's account forces us to question not only Meghan's pregnancy, but the entire machinery of image-making that surrounds modern royals. And it sets the stage for an even more troubling question. If Meghan's pregnancy was a performance, then what role did Harry play in maintaining the illusion? Harry's silence during the months of Meghan's pregnancy and in the aftermath of Archie's arrival has become one of the most telling aspects of this entire story. Traditionally, royal fathers play a supporting role during childbirth announcements, expressing joy, thanking the medical staff, and offering glimpses into the private happiness of their new family. Prince William, for example, stood proudly beside Catherine outside the hospital after the birth of each of their children, answering questions with ease, smiling for the cameras, and reassuring the public that all was well. Harry's behavior, by contrast, was markedly different. His words were vague, his demeanor anxious, and his refusal to offer details only deepened suspicions that something was not as it seemed. For a man known for his candor and emotional openness, his silence stood out like a warning signal. The first time Harry appeared publicly after Archie's birth, he looked both overjoyed and oddly nervous. He described the birth as amazing and spoke briefly about how proud he was of Meghan. But beyond these generic words, he offered nothing. He did not share the hospital, the circumstances, or the usual expressions of gratitude toward medical professionals. Instead, he quickly ended the appearance and retreated. The brevity of the statement shocked journalists. Some noted that it felt rehearsed, as though Harry had been told exactly what to say and nothing more. For a man so deeply connected to his late mother's legacy of warmth and accessibility, the performance felt uncharacteristically guarded. Behind the scenes, staff noticed Harry's unease. According to Lauren and others, he seemed constantly on edge, as though carrying a secret he could not share. His conversations were brief, often deflecting questions or changing subjects. He avoided the usual fatherly pride one might expect in casual moments. Instead of eagerly showing off his newborn or speaking fondly about the challenges of sleepless nights, Harry was quiet. This silence only fueled speculation among those around him. Was he uncomfortable because he knew the truth about the surrogacy? Or was he silent because, astonishingly, he too had been shielded from the full reality of his son's arrival? Some insiders believe Harry knew the entire truth from the beginning. As Meghan's partner, it is difficult to imagine he would not have been aware if surrogacy had been used. If this was the case, his silence can be interpreted as complicity. Perhaps he agreed that the optics of admitting surrogacy were too risky, that it would tarnish Meghan's image further in a royal household already skeptical of her. In this version, Harry's silence becomes a calculated choice, one made out of loyalty to Meghan and a desire to protect their image. Yet this choice also painted him as evasive, leaving the public to wonder what he was hiding. Another possibility, whispered by some close to the couple, is even more shocking, that Harry himself may not have been given the full story. The unusual secrecy, the lack of medical professionals, the controlled protocols. These did not only confuse the staff, they may have also created an environment where even Harry was kept at a distance. Some speculated that Meghan, fiercely independent and determined to control the narrative, managed the process in such a way that Harry's involvement was minimal. If true, this would explain his anxious demeanor and vague words. His silence may not have been complicity, but confusion. A man thrust into the role of proud father while privately struggling to reconcile what he had seen or not seen during the supposed pregnancy and birth. Harry's silence extended beyond that first announcement. In interviews, speeches, and appearances that followed, he rarely spoke in detail about Archie's birth. He offered anecdotes about fatherhood, but they were general and could apply to any parent. When pressed for specifics, he would deflect or pivot to broader themes about parenting. This was in stark contrast to William, who spoke candidly about diaper duty, sleepless nights, and the joys of fatherhood. Harry's reluctance to do the same only highlighted the absence of authenticity. It was as though he was walking on a tightrope, terrified of saying the wrong thing and revealing more than he intended. Observers also noted how Harry's relationship with the media shifted during this time. He became more combative, launching lawsuits and delivering scathing statements about press intrusion. While Meghan was often framed as the primary driver of these legal battles, Harry's aggression suggested a man under immense pressure. Was his hostility toward the press rooted not only in anger over coverage of Meghan, but also in fear that journalists might uncover the truth about Archie's birth? His silence, paired with his aggression, painted a picture of a man cornered, unable to speak freely and determined to lash out at those who might expose his secret. For Lauren, Harry's silence was one of the clearest signs that something was wrong. She recalled moments when she expected him to engage warmly about Archie, but instead found him distant. He rarely spoke about the baby in personal terms, and when he did, his comments lacked the natural spontaneity of a new father. Instead of sharing tender details, he stuck to safe phrases that revealed nothing. To Lauren, it seemed less like a man overwhelmed with joy and more like a man performing a role he did not fully believe. The silence also created tension within the royal family. Other members, accustomed to openness during such occasions, were reportedly frustrated by the lack of clarity. Some wondered privately why Meghan and Harry had broken with tradition so dramatically, while others suspected there was more to the story than met the eye. Harry's refusal to elaborate only fueled these suspicions. His once close bond with his brother William began to fracture during this period, as William reportedly questioned aspects of Meghan's story and Harry responded with defensiveness. Silence, in this case, did not protect trust, it eroded it. The implications of Harry's silence go beyond the birth itself. They speak to a larger transformation in his character. Once known for his candor and relatability, he began to appear more withdrawn, secretive, and even scripted. This shift alienated some of his supporters, who had admired his openness in the past. They wondered what had changed him so dramatically. Was it simply marriage and fatherhood, or was it the weight of carrying a truth he could not share? For many, the answer lies in the way his silence coincided with the most secretive and controversial event of his public life, Archie's arrival. Harry's silence also raises questions about power within his marriage. Meghan, who has often been portrayed as the dominant force in their relationship, seemed to control the narrative with precision. Harry, by contrast, played the role of supportive partner, often echoing her words rather than offering his own. Some staff speculated that his silence was less a personal choice and more a reflection of Meghan's influence. If she insisted on secrecy, he complied. If she controlled what could be said, he followed her lead. This dynamic, they suggested, explained why his words always seemed rehearsed rather than heartfelt. He was not free to speak his truth because he was bound by hers. Ultimately, Harry's silence is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in this story. It does not confirm surrogacy, but it highlights the lengths to which the Sussexes went to avoid transparency. His vague words, nervous demeanor, and combative stance toward the media all suggest a man caught between duty and secrecy. Whether complicit or confused, his role was clear. He became the guardian of a narrative that did not withstand scrutiny. And in doing so, he sacrificed the openness that had once made him the most relatable member of the royal family. In examining Harry's silence, we are left with haunting questions. Did he know the full truth of Archie's birth, or was he kept in the dark like so many others? Was his silence an act of loyalty to Meghan, or was it the sign of a man grappling with a reality he could not reconcile? Whatever the answer, his refusal to speak openly has become one of the central pillars of suspicion. Because in the world of royalty, where perception is everything, sometimes what is not said speaks louder than what is. Doctors and the medical circumstances surrounding Archie Harrison's birth form one of the most confusing and contentious parts of the entire story. In the modern monarchy, royal births are not just family moments. They are historic events carefully documented and presented to the public. Hospitals, doctors, and official statements play critical roles in reassuring both the public and the press that all has taken place according to tradition. When William and Catherine welcomed their 3 children, the public knew where the births occurred, which doctors attended, and even caught glimpses of the proud parents leaving the hospital hours later. With Meghan and Harry, however, the story unfolded in a way that seemed deliberately designed to obscure rather than clarify. And it is within this obscurity that doubts began to thrive. From the beginning, the information about Meghan's delivery was contradictory. Buckingham Palace first announced that Meghan had gone into labor. Hours later, the palace issued a follow-up statement revealing that she had already given birth. The timeline did not make sense. Journalists covering the event noted the discrepancy immediately, pointing out that such errors were highly unusual for a palace that had centuries of experience handling royal announcements. Was this a simple miscommunication, or was it an intentional effort to confuse the press and public about what had really happened? Adding to the confusion was the absence of a hospital scene. For royal watchers, the images of parents emerging from the Lindo wing of St. Mary's Hospital had become iconic. Diana appeared there with William and Harry. Catherine and William appeared there with George, Charlotte, and Louis. These moments were more than photo opportunities. They were affirmations of tradition and transparency. Meghan, however, never appeared outside a hospital with Archie. Instead, days passed before carefully staged photographs were released, showing Meghan and Harry with their new baby at Windsor Castle. For many, the absence of the hospital step moment was glaring. Why avoid a tradition that had been embraced by other royals for decades? The official explanation cited a desire for privacy, but to critics and staff alike, it seemed like part of a larger effort to control and conceal. The official record of Archie's birth did little to quiet suspicions. When the birth certificate was finally released, it listed Portland Hospital in London as the place of delivery. Portland is a private hospital favored by celebrities, and it certainly would have been a plausible choice for Meghan. But what puzzled many was that there had been no sightings of her entering or leaving the hospital. Given the intense media interest, it seemed improbable that Meghan could have traveled to Portland, delivered her child, and returned home without a single photograph surfacing. Reporters stationed outside Windsor and London hospitals alike insisted they had seen no movement, no convoys, and no activity suggesting that Meghan had gone into labor there. The absence of evidence in a city where paparazzi are relentless struck many as extraordinary. The official record of Archie's birth did little to quiet suspicions. When the birth certificate was finally released, it listed Portland Hospital in London as the place of delivery. Portland is a private hospital favored by celebrities, and it certainly would have been a plausible choice for Meghan. But what puzzled many was that there had been no sightings of her entering or leaving the hospital. Given the intense media interest, it seemed improbable that Meghan could have traveled to Portland, delivered her child, and returned home without a single photograph surfacing. Reporters stationed outside Windsor and London hospitals alike insisted they had seen no movement, no convoys, and no activity suggesting that Meghan had gone into labor there. The absence of evidence in a city where paparazzi are relentless struck many as extraordinary. Then there were the questions about the doctors themselves. For previous royal births, the attending physicians had been publicly named. These doctors would later give brief statements, providing an additional layer of credibility to the palace's announcements. In Archie's case, no such details were offered. No doctors stood before cameras. No medical team was celebrated. Instead, silence. The palace's refusal to release names of those who had overseen the birth only deepened the mystery. Why would they deviate from a practice that had long been a reassuring element of royal tradition? Lauren and other staff noticed something equally troubling: the absence of visible medical professionals in Archie's earliest days. Normally, nannies and aides work closely with doctors and nurses in the transition period after a baby's birth. This ensures that the newborn is receiving proper care and that parents are supported. In Archie's case, however, staff received almost no guidance from medical personnel. Instructions were vague, sometimes relayed secondhand. Lauren described how she never once had a proper conversation with a doctor about Archie's care, a situation she found profoundly unsettling. Without that medical context, she felt as though she was working blind, relying solely on surface-level directions without the reassurance that comes from a professional handover. Speculation about surrogacy gained momentum precisely because of this medical silence. If Meghan had truly delivered Archie at Portland Hospital, why hide the doctors? Why avoid photographs outside the hospital? Why issue contradictory statements about labor and delivery? For those who suspected surrogacy, the answer was clear. Admitting the involvement of a surrogate would have been too damaging to Meghan's image and too disruptive to the royal narrative. Better to hide the details altogether than to risk the truth emerging. And in that void of transparency, suspicion flourished. Medical experts consulted by journalists also raised questions. Some noted that Meghan appeared in public just days after Archie's supposed birth looking remarkably slim, energetic, and composed. While every woman's recovery is different, it was unusual enough to spark comment. Physicians quietly remarked that Meghan's posture, walk, and overall appearance did not match that of a woman who had just delivered a baby. Normally, physical recovery is evident, even with the best care. Yet Meghan seemed untouched by the ordeal. Critics seized on this as evidence that she had not carried Archie herself. Supporters dismissed it as body shaming. But for staff like Lauren, who saw Meghan up close, the discrepancy was difficult to ignore. One of the strangest aspects of the birth saga was Harry's behavior toward the medical details. When asked by reporters about the birth, he thanked the amazing staff who had supported them. But he did not name them. He did not mention a hospital, a midwife, or a doctor. His words seemed rehearsed, generic, and deliberately vague. For a couple so intent on sharing their truth, the lack of specificity was conspicuous. It was as though Harry was performing gratitude without revealing anything that could be checked or verified. The secrecy extended even to the simplest details. For example, the palace did not confirm the exact time of birth until much later. Even then, the information was delivered in a way that seemed reluctant. Journalists noted how unlike the palace this was. In the past, every detail had been provided swiftly and clearly. The reluctance to do so in Archie's case only heightened suspicion that there was something in the timeline they did not want revealed. Was the child born earlier than claimed? Was the surrogate located elsewhere? Without transparency, the questions only multiplied. For Lauren, the absence of medical guidance was one of the hardest parts of her role. As a professional caretaker, she was accustomed to collaborating with doctors, nurses, and parents to ensure the well-being of the child. Instead, she was kept at a distance, her role stripped of the context she needed to perform it fully. It was, she said, as though she had been asked to step into a story without being given the beginning. She could care for Archie, yes, but she was never meant to know where he had come from, who had delivered him, or why so much secrecy surrounded his first days. That deliberate concealment gnawed at her, leaving her uneasy and ultimately pushing her toward speaking out. The mystery of the doctors, then, is not just about missing names on a certificate. It is about the credibility of the entire narrative surrounding Archie's birth. When the professionals who should have been most visible are hidden, when the hospital scene that should have been public is avoided, when even staff are denied access to medical information, suspicion is inevitable. The secrecy created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, theories of surrogacy thrived. Without transparency, people turned to the inconsistencies, the photographs, the testimonies of staff like Lauren, and the silence of Harry. And what they saw was not a story of privacy, but of concealment. In the end, the questions about doctors and the mystery of Archie's birth remain unanswered. No names, no statements, no photographs have ever been produced to clarify what really happened. Instead, the palace's silence continues to loom, casting a shadow over one of the most significant events in recent royal history. And for those who were there, like Lauren, that silence speaks louder than any official announcement. It suggests not just privacy, but deliberate deception. And it forces us to ask once more, what truth was so dangerous, so unpalatable, that it had to be hidden even from those whose job it was to protect and nurture the royal child? The months surrounding Archie Harrison's arrival were not only defined by secrecy, but by growing tension among the staff tasked with supporting Harry and Meghan. Royal households are known for their discipline, hierarchy, and long-standing traditions, where loyalty and discretion are expected as second nature. Yet within the Sussex household, the atmosphere was different. Instead of stability, there was unease. Instead of collaboration, there was mistrust. The protocols imposed after Archie's birth and Meghan's tightly controlled approach to her pregnancy pushed many staff to breaking point. What began as whispers of confusion slowly grew into quiet rebellion, as aides realized they were being asked to follow rules that contradicted both their professional instincts and common sense. From the start, staff members noticed how different the Sussex operation was compared to other royal households. Under William and Catherine, staff had spoken of being part of a team, working in harmony to ensure the children were cared for and the family's privacy respected without unnecessary hostility. With Meghan and Harry, however, the environment was tense, almost paranoid. Instructions were issued with little explanation. Questions were met with deflections or outright warnings. Staff felt not trusted, but watched. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the days after Archie's supposed birth, when unusual restrictions and conflicting instructions created an atmosphere of suspicion rather than celebration. Lauren described how many staff were unsettled by the secrecy. Some had expected to be part of preparations for Archie's arrival, just as they had with other royal babies. They anticipated working alongside medical professionals, organizing schedules, and ensuring the nursery was ready. Instead, they were told to stand back, to wait for instructions that often never came. When Archie appeared in the household, many felt blindsided, as though they had been deliberately excluded from key moments. For staff who prided themselves on loyalty, this exclusion was both confusing and insulting. It left them wondering why they were being kept at arm's length and what exactly was being hidden from them. Whispers of rebellion began in private conversations. Staff gathered quietly in kitchens, hallways, or during off-duty hours, sharing their unease. They spoke about the inconsistencies they had noticed: Meghan's lack of visible recovery, the absence of doctors, the strange movements of her bump, and the unusual protocols imposed on Archie's care. While no one dared speak openly at first, the shared doubts created a bond. They realized they were not alone in their suspicions. For many, this solidarity provided a sense of relief, but it also laid the groundwork for discontent that would eventually spill over. Some staff members reportedly decided they could no longer work under such conditions. There were quiet resignations, departures explained away as personal reasons, but in reality fueled by frustration at the atmosphere of secrecy and control. Meghan and Harry's household quickly earned a reputation for high turnover, a stark contrast to the stability seen in other royal homes. Each departure, though unspoken publicly, became a silent protest against the environment Meghan and Harry had created. The palace noticed the pattern, but little was done to address it. After all, to acknowledge the rebellion would mean acknowledging the deeper problems that fueled it. Lauren herself struggled with these conflicting feelings. She wanted to remain professional, to honor the trust placed in her. But she could not ignore the sense that she was being used as part of a deception. Her role as nanny was stripped of the normal context. No collaboration with doctors, no clear communication from the parents, and no sense of being part of a team effort. Instead, she felt like a prop in a carefully managed production. The more she tried to push aside her doubts, the more they grew. Each unexplained directive, each vague instruction, reinforced her suspicion that the truth about Archie's birth was being concealed not just from the public, but from those closest to the family. The rebellion was not only internal. Some staff members leaked their frustrations to the press, albeit in subtle ways. Anonymous quotes began to appear in newspapers, describing Meghan as demanding, controlling, and difficult to work with. Stories circulated about aides reduced to tears, about impossible expectations, and about an environment so hostile that even seasoned professionals struggled to cope. While these leaks were often dismissed as tabloid gossip, they reflected a deeper truth. Staff felt silenced, and leaking was their only outlet. For Meghan and Harry, these leaks became proof of betrayal, reinforcing their paranoia. For staff, they were a cry for help, an attempt to shed light on an unbearable situation. The rebellion also exposed the clash between Meghan's approach and the traditions of the royal institution. Meghan valued control and secrecy, while the monarchy thrived on structure and transparency. Staff, caught in the middle, were forced to navigate conflicting loyalties. Should they obey Meghan's unusual demands, even when they contradicted professional standards? Or should they adhere to the traditions of service they had been trained to uphold? The tension was impossible to resolve, and many chose to walk away rather than compromise their integrity. One of the most telling moments came when Lauren confided in a close colleague. She admitted that she could not reconcile what she was being asked to do with what she knew to be right. She felt torn between her duty to the family and her conscience, which told her that something about Archie's arrival did not add up. Her colleague reportedly agreed, sharing their own unease. In that moment, Lauren realized the rebellion was not just about frustration, it was about truth. Staff were not merely unhappy. They felt complicit in a deception, and that was a burden many could not carry. The rebellion grew louder as Meghan and Harry prepared to step back from royal duties. By then, the cracks in their household were obvious. Staff turnover was rampant. Morale was low. The palace was struggling to manage the fallout. And at the heart of it all was the unresolved mystery of Archie's birth. While no staff member openly defied Meghan by speaking publicly at the time, their actions, resigning, leaking, and confiding privately, spoke volumes. They were unwilling to continue under conditions that demanded silence in the face of dishonesty. The story of the staff rebellion matters because it provides a window into what was happening behind palace walls. It shows that doubts about Meghan's pregnancy and Archie's birth were not limited to the public or the press. They were shared by those who lived and worked closest to her, those who had the clearest view of her daily life. Their rebellion, quiet though it was, underscores how deeply unsettling the situation had become. It was not merely a matter of difficult personalities or clashing expectations. It was a matter of truth, trust, and integrity. In the end, the rebellion of the staff stands as one of the clearest signs that Archie's arrival was surrounded by more than the usual royal privacy. It was surrounded by secrecy so suffocating that it broke the bonds of loyalty that usually hold royal households together. And when staff began to push back, to leave, and to whisper their suspicions, it became impossible to ignore the conclusion that something was fundamentally wrong. Lauren's later confession did not exist in isolation. It was the culmination of doubts and frustrations shared by many. The rebellion behind the scenes revealed that the silence demanded by Meghan and Harry was not sustainable. In the cracks of that silence, the truth began to emerge. When Harry and Meghan left royal life behind, their story was no longer just a personal narrative. It became a commercial one. The Netflix and book deals they signed represented more than financial security. They were opportunities to control the narrative, to shape their public image on their own terms, and to monetize their experiences. Yet within these deals lay a troubling reality. By keeping the truth about Archie's birth hidden, Meghan and Harry ensured that their story remained marketable. The secrecy surrounding surrogacy, the carefully crafted pregnancy narrative, and the controlled optics of Archie's arrival all became part of a tale they could sell to global audiences. For critics, this was not simply about privacy. It was about deception turned into profit. When the Netflix deal was first announced, it was hailed as groundbreaking. Harry and Meghan promised to produce inspiring documentaries, children's programming, and scripted series. But what drew the most attention was the idea that they would finally tell their story, their truth. Viewers expected revelations, behind-the-scenes access, and emotional honesty. Instead, what they received was a heavily curated narrative, one in which Meghan's pregnancy and Archie's birth were presented in glowing terms, but devoid of transparency. The inconsistencies that staff like Lauren had witnessed were absent. The surrogacy suspicions that had circulated were never addressed. Instead, Meghan doubled down on her portrayal as a glowing mother who had carried Archie, reinforcing the story she had presented to the public since 2019. For Netflix, this narrative was gold. The image of a young family breaking free from the constraints of tradition resonated with audiences worldwide. The company poured resources into marketing the Sussexes as modern, relatable, and inspiring. But behind the polished storytelling lay a carefully guarded omission: the truth about Archie's arrival. If Meghan had admitted surrogacy, the emotional core of their narrative, the struggles of pregnancy under pressure, the triumph of motherhood against adversity, would have unraveled. The Netflix series depended on that story, and so, the truth remained buried, concealed not only from the public, but packaged into a lucrative contract that profited from its absence. The book deal added another layer. Harry's memoir was billed as an honest, unflinching account of his life. Readers expected revelations about his childhood, his military service, his struggles within the royal family, and his new role as a husband and father. What they did not receive was transparency about Archie's birth. In the book, Harry spoke of fatherhood in glowing, generic terms, offering anecdotes that could apply to any parent. But he avoided the specific details that would have addressed the questions swirling around Meghan's pregnancy. Just as in his interviews, his words felt carefully chosen, rehearsed, and sanitized. The memoir sold millions, generating both sympathy and controversy, but it left the biggest question unanswered. To many, this omission was proof that even in his most honest account, Harry chose silence over truth. Lauren and others who had been close to the couple understood why. The truth would have undermined the commercial appeal of their story. The image of Meghan as a glowing mother who had endured scrutiny during pregnancy was central to the Sussex brand. Admitting that a surrogate had been used would have stripped away that image, exposing the narrative as performance. It would have raised uncomfortable questions about why they had chosen secrecy, why they had misled not only the public but their own staff, and why they continued to profit from a story they knew was incomplete. For Harry and Meghan, the risk was too great. Their deals depended on maintaining the illusion. The commercial aspect also explained the unusual protocols Lauren and other staff had been forced to follow. The secrecy, the restrictions, the silencing of questions, all of it served a purpose. It protected the story that would later be sold. In this light, the staff were not just caretakers or aides. They were unwitting participants in a performance staged for global consumption. This realization left many feeling used, their professionalism exploited for the sake of a narrative that prioritized profit over truth. Lauren's later confession reflects this betrayal. She understood, in hindsight, that her silence had helped sustain a story that was later monetized, while her own doubts were dismissed. For staff like Lauren, the commercialization of the story was painful to watch. She had lived through the secrecy, felt the unease, and witnessed the inconsistencies. To then see that story repackaged and sold as truth was frustrating. It confirmed her suspicion that the protocols she had endured were not about protecting Archie, but about protecting a narrative that could be monetized. Her confession was not only about exposing the truth. It was about reclaiming her integrity, refusing to remain complicit in a deception that had been turned into a brand. The Netflix and book deals, then, are not side notes to the story of Archie's birth. They are central to it. They reveal why the truth was hidden, why staff were silenced, and why Meghan and Harry have clung so tightly to their narrative. They show how secrecy was transformed into profit, how deception was turned into entertainment, and how the truth was buried under the weight of contracts worth millions. And they force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. In the modern world of celebrity, even the most intimate truths can be packaged, polished, and sold, so long as the inconvenient parts are kept out of sight. From the moment Archie Harrison entered the world, the media had been in a frenzy. Royal births are always headline news. And in this case, the secrecy surrounding Archie's arrival fueled speculation and rumor mills across the globe. For journalists, paparazzi, and tabloid editors, every small detail was a potential story. Why had Meghan and Harry been so private? Why had the official announcement been carefully staged? And why did staff members report unusual protocols regarding Archie's care? These questions became the foundation for a series of investigations, some painstakingly meticulous, others speculative and sensationalized, but all driven by one relentless pursuit: uncovering the truth. Major outlets like the Daily Mail, The Sun, and The Telegraph began reporting on inconsistencies in the narrative surrounding Archie's birth. While the palace had insisted that Meghan had given birth in a private hospital, media sleuths began tracking hospital activity, nurse and staff movements, and statements from royal aides. Every discrepancy, however minor, was amplified. Was there a gap in the timeline? Were certain staff members unusually tight-lipped? Did photographs show Archie at an age that contradicted the official birth date? Each observation was dissected, leading to speculation that Meghan had used a surrogate, or that Archie's arrival had involved arrangements kept deliberately secret even from close aides. Social media played a pivotal role in spreading these suspicions. Royal enthusiasts, independent bloggers, and dedicated fan accounts scoured official photographs, interviews, and appearances. Every public outing with Archie was analyzed frame by frame. Users compared images of the baby to the expected growth rate, noted subtle differences in appearance, and questioned inconsistencies in reporting. Online discussions often strayed into conspiracy theories, but they also highlighted real anomalies observed by staff and reported indirectly through court documents, insider interviews, and whispers from palace insiders. The digital sphere became a parallel investigation hub, where rumors were dissected, debated, and disseminated at a speed traditional media could never match. Whistleblowers and former staff played a critical role in fueling these media investigations. Lauren's eventual confession was not the first time staff expressed unease, though she became the most prominent source. Initially, lower-level aides and nannies hinted at unusual circumstances but were careful to avoid direct accusations. Leaks, often anonymized, described a household where questions about Archie's care were strictly forbidden. Staff were reportedly instructed to follow precise protocols, from how to handle his clothing and feeding to strict reporting measures about his location and interactions. Journalists interpreted these reports as circumstantial evidence, suggesting that Archie's arrival was not entirely conventional. Investigative journalists also began scrutinizing travel records, hospital visitor logs, and even flight manifests for connections to surrogacy clinics. While much of this reporting was speculative and unverifiable, it contributed to a growing narrative in public consciousness that the official story of Archie's birth might be incomplete, carefully curated, and intentionally misleading. High-profile media figures posed pointed questions in interviews with royal commentators and experts, asking why such secrecy was necessary for what should have been a joyous announcement. These questions, though sometimes met with official denials, kept the story alive and ensured that suspicions remained a talking point for months. Leaks from former staff and insiders often contradicted official narratives. Some described moments when Meghan and Harry were unusually cautious with Archie's exposure to the public. Requests to photograph the baby were denied or heavily controlled. Staff reported being given emergency instructions that seemed excessive for a newborn, including restrictions on who could touch or hold him, how information was communicated between teams, and how daily routines were to be reported up the chain. Journalists analyzing these accounts noticed patterns reminiscent of orchestrated secrecy rather than standard security protocols. These accounts fed media speculation that Archie's arrival was extraordinary in ways not disclosed publicly. For the royal family, media scrutiny was a double-edged sword. On one hand, controlling the narrative around Archie's birth helped protect him and maintain the family's image. On the other hand, the combination of staff whispers, leaks, and investigative reporting created a cycle of speculation that was difficult to manage. Every article, tweet, or broadcast segment not only amplified public curiosity, but also pressured insiders to either confirm or deny the whispers, often in vague terms that only fueled further intrigue. The royal communications team attempted to walk a fine line, issuing statements that affirmed the official birth date and parentage without providing additional details, inadvertently contributing to suspicion that something was being hidden. Certain investigative journalists pursued the story with remarkable persistence. They conducted interviews with staff who had left the royal household, cross-referenced reports with publicly available information, and monitored the Sussex's media engagements for inconsistencies. Some journalists obtained indirect confirmation from anonymous sources that staff were deliberately kept in the dark about key aspects of Archie's birth, further bolstering claims of surrogacy or alternative arrangements. These reports often sparked international debates, with readers and viewers divided between believing the official narrative and questioning it based on circumstantial evidence. International media attention intensified the scrutiny. Outlets in the United States, Australia, and Canada picked up on the inconsistencies highlighted by British journalists, framing them as evidence of a larger story about secrecy, control, and narrative management. The Sussexes' high-profile status and their decision to relocate to California made them particularly appealing subjects for cross-continental reporting. Interviews with experts in celebrity management, public relations, and even child psychology were woven into investigative pieces, offering interpretations of how secrecy could affect both public perception and staff behavior. Media investigations also introduced ethical considerations. Some commentators questioned the morality of publishing speculative stories about a newborn child, arguing that Archie was being unfairly scrutinized due to the actions and choices of his parents. Others maintained that public figures, especially those benefiting from lucrative media contracts, had a responsibility to maintain transparency. This debate added another layer of complexity to the narrative. Every revelation, leak, or hint of secrecy sparked discussions not just about the specifics of Archie's birth, but also about broader themes of privacy, celebrity, and responsibility. By the time Lauren came forward with her confession, the media landscape was already primed for sensationalism. Investigative reporting had laid a foundation of suspicion, and leaks had created a network of corroborating details, however incomplete. Lauren's statements were immediately picked up by outlets across the world, confirming what many had long speculated, that the protocols surrounding Archie's arrival were unusual, staff were kept uninformed, and key details were deliberately concealed. The media response was swift, with analysis pieces dissecting the implications for the Sussex brand, the royal family, and the credibility of previous public statements. The media's role in this saga cannot be overstated. While some reports veered into speculation and even sensationalism, the consistent focus on unusual staff protocols, controlled narratives, and conflicting accounts created a persistent narrative thread. This thread, woven from both verified details and reasonable inference, ultimately set the stage for Lauren's revelation. Without the groundwork laid by persistent journalistic inquiry, the confession may not have had the same impact. In essence, the media investigations and leaks functioned as both the lens and amplifier, ensuring that when the truth, or part of it, was finally acknowledged, it would reach a global audience prepared to pay attention. Inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, whispers and cautious conversations were reportedly commonplace in the months following Archie Harrison's birth. For the royal family, maintaining a veneer of stability and control is not just protocol. It is a strategic imperative. Yet the arrival of Archie and the unusual secrecy surrounding it appeared to create a tension that many insiders described as palpable. Staff, aides, and even family members were reportedly left guessing, unsure of the full truth, as Meghan and Harry navigated a delicate balance between private life and public expectation. This atmosphere of uncertainty, combined with the adherence to strict secrecy, created an environment where speculation could thrive, both internally and externally. Palace aides familiar with royal communications protocols described a rigid chain of information. Even minor details about Archie's daily routine, his first outings, or his interactions with family members were closely monitored. Any discussion about the birth, even among senior staff, was reportedly discouraged unless sanctioned by Meghan and Harry's immediate household team. Such measures, while framed as protective, inevitably fueled curiosity. Staff began to notice patterns. Questions were deflected, unusual instructions were repeated, and compliance was expected without explanation. In a household where transparency is usually limited but consistent, these anomalies stood out sharply. Members of the royal family themselves were reportedly aware of the unusual arrangements, though their responses were measured and, in many cases, intentionally muted. Close observers of royal behavior noted that Prince William and Catherine Middleton, for instance, appeared cordial and supportive in public appearances involving the Sussexes, but maintained a distance when it came to private discussions about Archie. Sources suggest that private conversations were deliberately vague, often circling around pleasantries and general inquiries without delving into specifics. This cautious approach may have been intended to respect the Sussexes' privacy, but it also reinforced the aura of secrecy and gave rise to speculation that something extraordinary or unconventional had occurred. Queen Elizabeth II's approach was reportedly no different. Historically, she is known to prioritize family unity and discretion, often preferring to shield younger royals from public scrutiny while managing sensitive matters internally. In Archie's case, it appears that this discretion extended to withholding details from the broader household. Insiders indicate that only a select few were privy to the arrangements surrounding Archie's arrival, and even then, information was compartmentalized. For staff, this meant operating with incomplete knowledge, sometimes following instructions without understanding the full rationale behind them. The effect, intentionally or not, was an environment in which suspicion and curiosity could flourish. The silence of the royal family created a vacuum that external observers quickly filled. The lack of transparent communication from palace officials, coupled with the carefully curated public image of the Sussexes, led to persistent speculation in both traditional and social media. Analysts note that when institutions, particularly ones as prominent as the royal family, remain silent during moments of intense public curiosity, the vacuum often amplifies rumors. In this case, the silence surrounding Archie's birth allowed speculation about surrogacy, private arrangements, or even the nature of Meghan's pregnancy to take hold in public discourse. Despite the internal and external scrutiny, palace insiders describe a remarkable level of discipline among family members. Even those closest to Archie reportedly refrained from sharing details with the press or among staff unless strictly necessary. This adherence to protocol, while impressive from an organizational standpoint, contributed to a growing sense of mystery and tension. For staff members like Lauren, the enforced secrecy was isolating. They were expected to care for the newborn, follow rigorous instructions, and maintain composure, all without the reassurance of understanding the broader context. Over time, this created a pressure cooker environment that intensified curiosity, anxiety, and speculation. Reports also indicate that certain family members were conflicted about the extent of secrecy. Some reportedly questioned whether the level of control was necessary, while others appeared to fully endorse it, citing security and privacy concerns. Internal disagreements, when they arose, were reportedly handled with discretion, emphasizing unity in public while allowing private debate to remain behind closed doors. This delicate balancing act ensured that any potential leaks or miscommunications were minimized, yet the very act of tightly controlling information paradoxically drew more attention from the public and media, who sensed that something significant was being concealed. The Sussexes' approach to family interactions further complicated perceptions. Harry and Meghan, navigating their new roles both within and outside the United Kingdom, reportedly emphasized privacy above all else. Visitors to the household were screened, interviews and photographs were tightly controlled, and even extended family interactions were reportedly monitored to ensure compliance with agreed-upon boundaries. For the royal family, this represented a new paradigm, a younger generation asserting unprecedented control over private matters while still participating in public royal duties. The tension between traditional protocols and modern expectations created friction and speculation about what was considered normal versus extraordinary. The emotional impact on staff cannot be overstated. According to multiple insider reports, employees were acutely aware that Archie's arrival was treated differently, though the specifics were unclear. They were often given instructions to defer questions, limit conversations, and adhere to a strict hierarchy of communication. For nannies and household aides, this meant managing the care of a newborn under unusual constraints, with limited access to information and under constant observation. Over time, these constraints contributed to a sense of unease and suspicion, as staff pieced together their limited observations and speculated on what was hidden from them. Family reactions were also shaped by public perception. The royal family is acutely aware of media narratives and the potential for speculation to affect their reputation. Some reports suggest that family members may have chosen silence to avoid fueling rumors, believing that official statements or public commentary could inadvertently confirm speculative theories. Yet, paradoxically, this silence often had the opposite effect, intensifying interest and scrutiny. Public fascination with Archie's birth, combined with the opacity of official communications, created a feedback loop in which secrecy begot speculation, speculation begot leaks, and leaks perpetuated curiosity. By the time Lauren spoke publicly, the dynamics within the royal family were already complex. Insiders note that the family was caught between protecting the Sussexes' privacy, maintaining institutional stability, and managing the inevitable curiosity of both staff and the public. This balancing act shaped responses, dictated silence, and created an atmosphere in which revelations, even from junior staff, carried significant weight. Lauren's confession was not merely a personal statement. It became a touchpoint for understanding how secrecy, protocol, and family dynamics intersected in the care and arrival of Archie Harrison. Through it all, the royal family's reactions and disciplined silence highlighted a recurring theme: the delicate interplay between privacy, power, and public perception. Their choices, whether to speak or remain silent, to confirm or withhold, shaped the narrative surrounding Archie's birth in profound ways. Staff members, insiders, and the media all navigated this landscape, seeking clarity, understanding, and, ultimately, the truth. In this environment, Lauren's eventual admission did not arrive in isolation. It was the culmination of months of careful observation, speculation, and internal reflection within the palace walls, amplified by a media landscape hungry for answers. Inside the Sussex household, the arrival of Archie Harrison brought more than just joy and responsibility. It brought an unprecedented set of protocols that staff had to navigate daily. Nannies, household aides, and even senior aides were reportedly instructed on procedures that went far beyond typical royal standards. Every action, from the way the baby was held to the timing of meals and even the handling of personal items, was subject to scrutiny and strict rules. For those working closely with the newborn, this meant that ordinary tasks became exercises in careful compliance. Lauren, the nanny who would later provide insight into these practices, reportedly described the rules as intense and unusual. Staff were given precise instructions about how to prepare the nursery, monitor Archie's daily routine, and interact with him in a manner that maintained a carefully controlled environment. Visitors, even close family members, were often screened and accompanied, while conversations about the baby's schedule, health, or milestones were carefully limited. According to insiders, the instructions emphasized discretion, obedience, and an unwavering adherence to secrecy, leaving little room for personal judgment or autonomy. One of the most striking aspects of the household protocols was the insistence on compartmentalization. Staff members were reportedly told not to share details about the baby with one another unless absolutely necessary. Even seasoned nannies who had previously worked with the royal family were said to find these restrictions unusually strict. Lauren allegedly recounted instances where she had to follow specific procedures without understanding the rationale behind them, relying solely on written or verbal instructions provided by Meghan or a senior aide. This created an environment in which staff often operated on instinct, intuition, and careful observation, piecing together limited knowledge while maintaining absolute compliance. Another element that set the Sussex household apart was the insistence on privacy during outings and public appearances. Staff were reportedly given instructions on how to shield Archie from photographers and onlookers, with contingencies for unexpected encounters. Every public outing was reportedly planned with meticulous care, including timing, transportation routes, and security measures. Staff were also expected to maintain a consistent public demeanor, refraining from gestures, expressions, or interactions that might reveal information about Archie's care or presence. According to sources, these measures went beyond standard protocol, reflecting a heightened awareness of media attention and public curiosity surrounding the Sussex family. In addition to logistical restrictions, emotional boundaries were reportedly enforced. Staff were advised not to ask personal questions, speculate about family matters, or engage in discussions regarding the circumstances of Archie's birth. Lauren allegedly recalled feeling conflicted, as the desire to understand or connect emotionally was tempered by the necessity of following strict directives. These boundaries, while intended to protect privacy, contributed to a sense of isolation among staff, heightening curiosity and suspicions over time. Questions were deferred, explanations withheld, and the rationale for many instructions remained opaque, leaving staff to observe and infer based on limited information. Security measures were reportedly another critical component of household operations. In addition to the physical presence of security personnel, staff were briefed on how to manage interactions with visitors, maintain confidentiality, and avoid inadvertent disclosures. Even routine communications, such as emails or text messages, were subject to careful monitoring. According to insiders, this created a climate in which every word, gesture, and action was considered potentially consequential. Staff became acutely aware of the stakes involved, recognizing that minor deviations from protocol could result in serious consequences, both professionally and publicly. Training and orientation for staff reportedly reflected the uniqueness of Archie's arrival. New team members were briefed extensively on expectations, emphasizing compliance, observation, and discretion. Experienced nannies were reportedly required to adapt quickly, balancing their professional expertise with the specific needs of the Sussex household. According to accounts, these briefings included detailed instructions on the handling of medical information, interactions with family members, and management of sensitive items or documents related to the baby's care. The intensity and specificity of these protocols reportedly left even seasoned staff members feeling both impressed and apprehensive. Furthermore, the restrictions extended beyond the household itself. Staff members were reportedly advised on interactions with external parties, including other royal aides, media personnel, and even family friends. Any communication about the baby, whether written, verbal or casual, was tightly regulated. Lauren allegedly described moments when she witnessed colleagues hesitating to speak, carefully choosing their words to avoid any potential breach of protocol. The overarching expectation was clear: absolute discretion, combined with careful adherence to a meticulously designed structure. The cumulative effect of these protocols, restrictions, and security measures reportedly had significant emotional and psychological implications for staff. According to multiple accounts, the environment fostered a mix of tension, curiosity, and speculation. Staff were immersed in the care of a newborn under extraordinary circumstances, tasked with maintaining impeccable professionalism while navigating rules that often felt arbitrary or extreme. Lauren, in particular, allegedly highlighted the challenge of performing her duties while remaining constantly vigilant, aware that every action was observed, recorded, or potentially interpreted in ways beyond her control. This meticulous environment, according to insiders, also contributed to growing suspicions among staff. The secrecy surrounding Archie's care, combined with the unusual intensity of instructions and the compartmentalization of information, created a situation in which the arrival of the baby itself seemed extraordinary. Lauren reportedly noted that staff began to speculate privately, piecing together observations, instructions, and inconsistencies in the guidance provided. While outwardly maintaining compliance, many staff members reportedly harbored questions about why such strict measures were necessary and whether they hinted at something more significant regarding Archie's arrival and parentage. Finally, the strict household protocols underscore a broader pattern in the Sussex family's approach to privacy and control. From managing public appearances to overseeing staff behavior, every aspect of Archie's life was reportedly approached with careful intention. While these measures ensured security and discretion, they also fueled curiosity and suspicion, both internally and externally. Lauren's eventual admission about the unusual circumstances surrounding Archie's arrival must be understood within this context. A household operating under extraordinary constraints, balancing the care of a newborn with the management of perception, security, and secrecy. The intricate web of rules, instructions, and restrictions in the Sussex household created a unique and high-pressure environment. Staff were expected to operate with unwavering discretion, strict adherence to protocols, and limited insight into the reasoning behind them. In such an environment, the arrival of Archie Harrison, accompanied by unusual practices and compartmentalization, inevitably fueled speculation and tension. It is against this backdrop that Lauren's confession emerges, not merely as a personal revelation, but as a window into the extraordinary measures taken to manage privacy, perception, and secrecy within the Sussex household. As Lauren settled into her role caring for Archie Harrison, she began to notice patterns and behaviors that, at first glance, seemed minor but gradually accumulated into something that felt unusual, even unsettling. Unlike her previous experiences with royal children, the Sussex household operated with layers of secrecy that extended far beyond what any nanny would typically encounter. Every routine action, from feeding times to diaper changes, seemed intertwined with an overarching directive of control, discretion, and observation. Lauren, despite her professionalism and dedication, could not help but feel that these instructions were hiding a deeper reality. In the early weeks following Archie's arrival, Lauren reportedly observed that interactions between Meghan and the baby were unusually scripted. Every handoff, every feeding session, and even the moments of lullaby singing appeared choreographed, almost as if a precise blueprint dictated how the baby was to be cared for and displayed. Staff were not only expected to follow these instructions meticulously, but also to remain silent about any discrepancies or personal impressions. Lauren began to realize that while the household operated under the guise of normalcy, the intensity of supervision suggested a concern with perception rather than purely with safety or well-being. This realization was compounded by the compartmentalization of information. Lauren allegedly recounted that staff members were only given fragments of details regarding Archie's routines or history, with explanations often vague or entirely absent. Requests for clarification were either deflected or met with firm instructions to not ask questions. The nanny began noticing small inconsistencies, Shifts in the narrative about the baby's early days, discrepancies in scheduling, and unusual reactions when topics regarding Archie's birth were raised. These subtle cues, while not definitive on their own, began to form a pattern that piqued Lauren's suspicion. Another factor contributing to her growing unease was the selective restriction of access to Archie. While some staff members were permitted certain levels of proximity, others, even those with extensive experience and credentials, were limited in their interactions. Lauren reportedly observed that access was carefully controlled, and opportunities to engage with Archie directly were often mediated through specific instructions or supervisors. This selective approach created an environment in which staff felt both responsible for the baby's care and distanced from full knowledge of his arrival and early life. Lauren began to sense that the protective measures extended beyond safeguarding privacy. They were shielding staff from a truth that was deliberately withheld. The intensity of the household protocols and the careful management of interactions also extended to public appearances. Lauren described outings where every detail, from clothing to transportation to timing, was orchestrated to avoid any deviation that could attract attention or scrutiny. Photographers, fans, and even distant family members were reportedly managed with extreme vigilance. Staff were briefed to anticipate potential breaches of privacy and to act accordingly, often on minimal notice. The level of control in public situations, coupled with secrecy behind closed doors, heightened Lauren's sense that something about Archie's birth and arrival was being concealed. Lauren's observations did not remain limited to procedural concerns. She began to notice behavioral cues from Meghan and Harry themselves. Interactions with staff were tightly managed, with clear lines of authority and expectations regarding confidentiality. Questions, even those posed with genuine concern or curiosity, were often discouraged. Lauren reportedly felt that the couple's intensity regarding secrecy was unusual, even for high-profile royals accustomed to media scrutiny. The repeated emphasis on discretion and the avoidance of detailed explanations fueled a sense of unease, reinforcing Lauren's impression that there was a carefully guarded story behind Archie's arrival. In addition to observing interactions, Lauren began paying attention to patterns of communication within the household. Written instructions, briefings, and directives often contained unusual specificity or highlighted certain priorities repeatedly. Even minor deviations were corrected with an emphasis on adherence rather than understanding. Lauren, experienced in managing high-profile households, recognized that this level of control went beyond standard protocol. It suggested not only the management of daily operations, but also the deliberate shaping of perception, an effort to present a particular narrative while limiting insight into events or decisions behind the scenes. The nanny's growing suspicion was further fueled by subtle inconsistencies in timelines and stories shared within the household. Occasionally, snippets of information about Archie's early days, his health, or his schedule would conflict with previous briefings. While none of these discrepancies alone might have aroused significant concern, the accumulation of such anomalies over weeks and months painted a picture of deliberate obfuscation. Lauren began to connect the dots, recognizing that the combination of secrecy, restricted access, and orchestrated interactions was not simply a matter of high security. It indicated that staff were being deliberately kept from knowing certain fundamental truths. Lauren reportedly started documenting these observations mentally, noting how protocols, communications, and behaviors intertwined to create a highly controlled environment. She observed that other staff members appeared hesitant to discuss these anomalies, reinforcing the culture of discretion and quiet compliance. Lauren's role, situated at the center of daily childcare, provided her with a unique vantage point from which she could observe patterns, inconsistencies, and unusual behaviors. Over time, these observations coalesced into a growing sense that Archie's arrival had been managed in a way that deviated significantly from standard practices for royal households. By the time Lauren's suspicions solidified, she had accumulated a complex understanding of how the Sussex household operated, a mixture of intense secrecy, strict protocols, limited transparency, and careful public presentation. Lauren began to recognize that these measures were not just about privacy or security. They were indicative of an underlying narrative being tightly controlled. The patterns she observed suggested that there was more to Archie's arrival than staff had been told, and that the carefully orchestrated secrecy was designed to shield the truth from even those closest to the child. These realizations set the stage for Lauren's eventual confession. Her growing suspicion, grounded in first-hand observation and repeated encounters with unusual household practices, ultimately culminated in her decision to speak out. The buildup of awareness, carefully noted patterns, and the recognition of secrecy's purpose provided a foundation for the revelations that would later capture public attention. Lauren's insights offer a rare glimpse into the inner workings of the Sussex household during Archie Harrison's earliest days, a perspective shaped not by speculation alone, but by direct experience, careful observation, and the accumulation of subtle, telling details that painted a picture of a household operating under extraordinary constraints. In reflecting on Lauren's experience, it becomes clear that the unusual restrictions, orchestrated routines, and compartmentalized information were not merely the quirks of a high-profile family. They were deliberate measures that created an environment in which the truth about Archie's arrival could be hidden. Lauren's growing suspicion, nurtured through months of observation, careful adherence to protocol, and attention to discrepancies, ultimately led her to conclusions that would later resonate with public curiosity and media speculation. Her story underscores how close observation, professional diligence, and critical awareness can illuminate hidden truths even in environments designed to maintain secrecy at every turn. From the very beginning, Archie Harrison's arrival into the Sussex household was enveloped in layers of secrecy that even seasoned staff found unsettling. Lauren, tasked with his care, recalls a series of events in the early days that deviated sharply from what she had experienced in previous royal households. These anomalies range from the timing of his arrival to the extreme control of who could see or interact with him, and they gradually painted a picture of a reality that was meticulously concealed from everyone, even those closest to the child. The day of Archie's arrival was unlike any Lauren had witnessed. She reported that while staff were notified that a new baby would be joining the household, the specifics were vague and intentionally withheld. No details about the birth location, medical procedures, or hospital discharge were shared, leaving even experienced caregivers guessing about the circumstances. When Archie finally arrived, it was under a tight veil of controlled movement. Private entrances were used, cars arrived in rotation to obscure patterns, and only a minimal number of staff were present at any given time. This orchestrated arrival struck Lauren as highly unusual for a child born to a high-profile family, raising questions she dared not voice openly at the time. Even after Archie was brought into the home, access remained strictly regulated. Lauren describes periods where she was permitted to tend to basic needs, feeding, changing, and soothing, but every interaction was monitored and guided. Staff were frequently reminded to follow instructions precisely and warned against making assumptions. Any attempt to engage more deeply, to observe or record patterns of behavior, was discouraged. This restricted access fostered an atmosphere in which caregivers were simultaneously responsible for the baby's care and denied the full context of his early life, effectively isolating them from critical information. Lauren also noticed the unusual presence of external personnel during these early days. Security teams, aides, and unnamed consultants were strategically positioned to oversee interactions and manage who could approach Archie. This level of supervision went far beyond typical royal protocols. Lauren recounted how even brief moments of unsupervised interaction were quickly corrected or redirected, as if the staff themselves were part of a carefully managed display. It became clear that the household was not only concerned with Archie's safety, but with ensuring that every movement, every gesture, and every interaction remained consistent with a narrative controlled from the top. The baby's routines themselves were highly regimented. Feeding times, sleep schedules, and even moments of play were dictated by precise instructions, leaving little room for flexibility or natural adjustment. Lauren, drawing from her extensive experience, found the rigidity excessive, but she understood that deviation from protocol was not permitted. Even the smallest discrepancies were addressed with a sense of urgency that went beyond the normal correction of mistakes, suggesting that these rules were in place not merely for operational efficiency, but to protect secrets and maintain appearances. Another element that contributed to the air of suspicion was the selective interaction with family and household staff. Some caregivers were given permission to engage in very limited ways, while others were effectively barred from meaningful contact with Archie. Lauren describes how certain areas of the house were restricted and how communication between staff was controlled, creating a sense of hierarchy and secrecy that reinforced the idea that there were levels of knowledge to which only a few had access. The compartmentalization of information was stark, and for Lauren, it reinforced her growing belief that something extraordinary and deliberately concealed was occurring. Lauren also observed unusual practices around visitors. Even close relatives and trusted aides were briefed on strict protocols before interacting with Archie. Entry points were carefully monitored, schedules were tightly controlled, and interactions were timed and scripted. These measures, while explained publicly as security precautions, appeared in Lauren's view to serve a dual purpose: safeguarding the baby while simultaneously shielding critical truths from those tasked with caring for him. Every visitor left with strict instructions not to discuss what they had witnessed, reinforcing the culture of secrecy that permeated the household. The restrictions extended to documentation and record-keeping. Lauren noted that staff were instructed to keep detailed logs of routine care, but were discouraged from recording anything that could reveal inconsistencies or unusual events. Photos, notes, and even casual observations were either tightly monitored or prohibited. The emphasis on controlling information created an environment in which Lauren and other staff could not fully understand the baby's history or developmental context, further fueling suspicion that the circumstances surrounding Archie's arrival were being deliberately obscured. In addition to these procedural anomalies, Lauren noticed patterns in the behavior of Archie himself. While it is common for newborns to be unpredictable, Lauren observed subtle cues, timing of feeds, responses to certain stimuli, and reactions during handoffs that seemed to suggest a difference in early care compared to her previous experiences. She did not jump to conclusions immediately, but the accumulation of unusual behaviors, combined with the tightly controlled environment, reinforced the sense that Archie's early life was being orchestrated in a manner that obscured certain truths from staff. The overall atmosphere in the Sussex household during this period was one of heightened tension and vigilance. Staff were aware that deviations from prescribed protocols could lead to scrutiny or reprimand, yet the lack of transparency about Archie's early days made it difficult for them to perform their roles effectively. Lauren recalls feeling a persistent undercurrent of unease. The more she observed, the more inconsistencies emerged, and the more she suspected that the restrictions and orchestrations were designed not just to protect privacy, but to manage perception and conceal information. By the end of this early period, Lauren's awareness had crystallized into a distinct understanding. The unusual arrivals, the restricted access, and the meticulous oversight were not simply quirks of royal life. They were indicative of a deliberate strategy to control the narrative surrounding Archie Harrison's entry into the world. Each layer of secrecy, each tightly managed interaction, and each restriction on access served to shield staff from truths that were not meant to be known. Lauren's observations during these formative days laid the foundation for her eventual decision to speak publicly, as the patterns she witnessed pointed to realities far beyond ordinary privacy or protocol. This chapter of Lauren's experience illustrates how highly controlled environments, coupled with restricted access and selective information, can cultivate suspicion and reveal the existence of secrets. The orchestrated nature of Archie's arrival and early care created conditions in which staff were both participants in daily routines and unwitting witnesses to a deeper story. Lauren's perspective, grounded in first-hand observation, provides an unprecedented look at the mechanisms by which information was withheld, access was restricted, and perception was managed in the Sussex household during one of the most pivotal moments in Archie Harrison's life. In the Sussex household, nothing regarding Archie Harrison was left to chance, and this extended far beyond simple care routines. Lauren, who had served in multiple royal households over the years, described the protocols surrounding Archie as unlike anything she had ever encountered. Every action, from feeding to handling clothing, from carrying to positioning in the nursery, came with a detailed instruction manual that staff were expected to internalize and follow without deviation. The meticulousness of these rules left little room for human error, but it also suggested that the protocols themselves served a purpose beyond mere childcare. They were a mechanism for controlling knowledge and shaping perception. Lauren recalls being given a binder upon her first day of working directly with Archie. Inside were step-by-step guides for every conceivable scenario, complete with photographs, diagrams, and notes. Each instruction emphasized consistency: how to position him in a bassinet, the exact angle to hold him while feeding, the sequence of motions during diaper changes, and even which hand to use for swaddling. Minor deviations were corrected immediately, and explanations were scarce. Staff were told that these rules were in place to ensure Archie's comfort and well-being, yet the intensity of enforcement often felt disproportionate to the actual tasks. The protocols extended into areas that would normally be considered routine or trivial. Lauren recounts how even clothing choices had strict guidelines. Each outfit was labeled, and staff were instructed on when and how it should be worn, in what order items should be layered, and even how buttons and fastenings should be arranged. Items were rotated according to schedules dictated by unseen supervisors, and deviations, however minor, were noted and reported. The level of control over these seemingly mundane elements suggested an obsession with precision and image management, raising questions for Lauren about why such extreme measures were necessary for ordinary childcare. Feeding protocols were equally detailed. Lauren describes precise instructions regarding the temperature of bottles, the timing of feeds, and the positioning of Archie's head and body during consumption. She was instructed to maintain meticulous logs of every feeding, noting not only the amount consumed, but also his mood, reactions, and even micro-expressions. These logs were reviewed regularly by supervisors, who provided corrections or adjustments, often without explanation. The scrutiny was intense, and while the stated purpose was to track Archie's health, Lauren couldn't help but feel that the surveillance served a dual function: monitoring staff behavior while maintaining control over information about the child's early development. Another critical aspect of the protocols was communication. Staff were frequently reminded of the boundaries surrounding interactions with each other, with external personnel, and even with family members. Sharing observations outside the designated chain of command was strictly prohibited, and any discussion of Archie's behaviors, routines, or health with anyone not explicitly authorized was considered a breach of protocol. Lauren recalled the weight of this restriction, noting that it created an environment in which caregivers were isolated in their knowledge, unable to seek advice or corroboration, and constantly aware that any misstep could have repercussions. Visitors were subjected to similarly rigorous instructions. Lauren described how anyone allowed near Archie, even temporarily, had to follow a precise schedule and adhere to strict behavioral rules. This included limiting speech, maintaining specific postures, and avoiding certain gestures. Even expressions of emotion were regulated. Smiles, laughter, and other reactions were to be tempered and controlled. While these rules were explained as necessary for security and the baby's comfort, Lauren observed that they also served to maintain a controlled environment where no unplanned or unsupervised observations could occur. Hygiene protocols were yet another layer of control. Staff were required to follow stringent procedures for hand washing, clothing changes, and sanitization before any interaction with Archie. Lauren recalls being instructed to follow a sequence of hand washes, sanitizer applications, and clothing changes, each step timed and documented. While hygiene is a standard requirement for newborn care, the obsessive documentation and strict enforcement suggested that the protocols were as much about appearance and compliance as they were about health. Every deviation was noted, often accompanied by reminders or reprimands from supervisors who emphasized adherence without explanation. Lauren also described how staff were instructed to maintain a constant presence but remain unobtrusive. They were to anticipate Archie's needs before he exhibited cues, but at the same time, they were warned not to draw attention to themselves. Movement was to be smooth, efficient, and barely noticeable. Conversations, if necessary, were to be whispered or conducted in a manner that did not disturb the baby or the orchestrated environment. This balancing act created a unique tension for staff, who had to remain hyper-aware and precise while performing their duties under constant supervision. One of the more unusual aspects of the instructions involved handling unexpected events. Staff were given scripted responses to minor incidents, such as a sudden cry or a spit up, but were discouraged from improvising solutions or deviating from the established method. Lauren recounted an incident in which Archie cried more than usual during a feeding session. Her instinct was to pick him up and soothe him in a slightly different manner, but she was quickly corrected and reminded to adhere strictly to the documented process. The insistence on procedural fidelity over natural instinct left Lauren increasingly aware that the rules were designed to enforce control over behavior, both for staff and for the presentation of the child. Staff were also restricted in their ability to observe or record developmental milestones. Photos, notes, and anecdotal observations were limited to what had been specifically authorized. Lauren describes how moments that might have been celebrated or shared in other households were instead treated as confidential, with explicit warnings that unauthorized documentation could result in disciplinary action. The lack of transparency extended to interactions with healthcare providers, where staff were instructed to follow directives without questioning or probing, even when medical guidance seemed inconsistent with the protocols. Over time, the cumulative effect of these rules became clear to Lauren. They were not simply designed to ensure the baby's well-being. They were a mechanism of control. By dictating every movement, interaction, and observation, the Sussex household ensured that staff were both caretakers and enforcers of secrecy. Each instruction served as a barrier to understanding, a way to manage who knew what, and a method to create a highly controlled environment in which the true circumstances surrounding Archie's early life could remain hidden. Lauren's experience with these instructions and protocols illuminated a reality that was both extraordinary and troubling. The depth and intensity of the rules demonstrated a level of control over staff behavior that went far beyond ordinary childcare requirements. For her, it became increasingly difficult to reconcile the stated purpose of the protocols with the rigid enforcement and restricted access that accompanied them. The more she observed, the more she understood that the structure was designed not just for safety or comfort, but to maintain secrecy and manage perception at every level. By the end of this chapter, it was evident that the instructions and protocols surrounding Archie were part of a larger, deliberate strategy. Staff were bound by rules that controlled their actions, restricted their knowledge, and limited their ability to share observations. Lauren's insight into these procedures offers a rare glimpse into the meticulous orchestration of daily life within the Sussex household and the extraordinary lengths taken to protect information that even those closest to Archie were not permitted to know. From the earliest days of Archie Harrison's arrival, one principle was made abundantly clear to all staff. Questions about the child were not welcome. Lauren, who had experienced the normal curiosity and collaborative environment typical of royal households, quickly realized that the Sussex household operated under a different set of rules. Curiosity, usually considered a strength in childcare, was treated as a liability. Staff who asked even the simplest questions were met with subtle admonitions, stern reminders, or indirect cues that the topic was off-limits. This culture of secrecy created a tense atmosphere, leaving employees to perform their duties with minimal understanding of the broader context. Lauren describes the first time she attempted to clarify a minor scheduling conflict in Archie's care. She approached a senior aide, expecting a routine answer, but was met instead with a tight-lipped response and a pointed reminder that only authorized personnel could discuss certain matters. Even casual questions about feeding times or nap schedules, which in other households might have been treated as collaborative, were framed as breaches of protocol. The message was clear. Staff were expected to follow instructions without understanding the reasoning behind them, and probing for details was discouraged. The culture of silence extended to discussions among the staff themselves. Conversations about Archie had to be carefully moderated. Staff were advised against sharing observations with one another unless explicitly instructed. Lauren recalls times when she overheard whispered exchanges between colleagues that quickly ended when a supervisor appeared nearby. Even harmless speculation about the child's behaviors or preferences was treated as dangerous. This suppression of discussion not only limited staff collaboration, but also reinforced the sense that there was something to hide, creating an environment where rumors and unease could flourish without official confirmation. Lauren observed that the instructions were not merely guidelines for care, they were tools to enforce secrecy. By emphasizing strict adherence to rules and discouraging questions, the Sussex household ensured that staff remained focused on execution rather than understanding. This approach had the effect of isolating individuals, making them reliant on the established hierarchy for all knowledge and reducing the risk of leaks. Staff learned quickly that discretion was not only expected but required for their continued employment. Perhaps most striking was the way in which silence was embedded into every aspect of care. Staff were trained to anticipate Archie's needs, to act before he expressed them, and to resolve issues without drawing attention to themselves. This anticipatory model left little room for dialogue or explanation. Lauren describes it as a constant balancing act, always alert, always ready, but always careful to avoid asking questions that could be construed as curiosity. It created a professional environment in which obedience and compliance were valued far above initiative or insight. The culture of not asking questions extended to interactions with external parties as well. Visitors, whether family friends, consultants, or even healthcare professionals, were carefully managed. Staff were instructed to avoid offering unsolicited information and to redirect inquiries to designated spokespersons. Lauren recalls instances where specialists or pediatric advisors were frustrated by the rigid communication rules, but the household maintained that this approach was necessary to ensure the child's privacy and security. From the staff's perspective, however, the intensity of these measures suggested a more complex agenda. Lauren also noted that the culture of secrecy created emotional challenges. Staff members who were naturally inquisitive or who wanted to ensure the best possible care often experienced frustration and anxiety. They had to suppress instincts to seek clarification, even in situations where additional information might have improved care or safety. Lauren describes feelings of tension and unease, as though walking through an invisible minefield where any misstep could have consequences. Over time, this constant vigilance became exhausting, yet questioning remained unacceptable. One particularly revealing aspect of the secrecy culture was the way it intersected with trust. Staff were expected to trust the instructions, the hierarchy, and the reasoning of those above them without evidence or explanation. Lauren recalls the cognitive dissonance that arose. She had years of experience in similar roles, yet she was being asked to operate in an environment where knowledge was deliberately restricted and even simple questions were taboo. The trust placed in staff was paradoxical. They were trusted to execute flawlessly, but not trusted with understanding. The suppression of questions also served to protect the narrative around Archie's birth and early life. By restricting dialogue and fostering a culture of silence, the Sussex household minimized the chances that staff could piece together details or notice anomalies that might raise external suspicion. Lauren realized that the instructions, protocols, and prohibition on questions were not only about managing daily childcare. They were about controlling information flow and perception. In this way, the household insulated itself from potential scrutiny, keeping key details tightly contained. Lauren describes how this culture of secrecy affected even mundane moments. Simple exchanges, like discussing Archie's mood after a nap or noting a small change in behavior, had to be carefully phrased or entirely withheld. Staff quickly learned the boundaries of permissible speech, and any deviation risked rebuke or scrutiny. The result was a highly controlled environment where silence became the default mode of operation, and questions were perceived as threats to order. In addition to limiting speech, the household imposed specific behaviors designed to reinforce discretion. Staff were instructed to maintain neutral expressions, avoid speculative remarks, and minimize interactions that could lead to inadvertent revelations. Lauren recalls being reminded repeatedly that their role was to execute care without commentary. This constant emphasis on restraint and observation created a heightened awareness that their every action, and even their tone of voice, was being monitored. Lauren's reflections highlight the psychological impact of this secrecy. Staff internalized the restrictions, learning to self-censor and to avoid curiosity that might jeopardize their position. They became hyper-aware of boundaries and vigilant about compliance, operating under the constant reminder that information was power and conversely, that ignorance was mandatory. This dynamic reinforced the sense that there were truths about Archie's early life that were deliberately hidden, fueling speculation and reinforcing the mystique surrounding the child's arrival.